Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Elisabeth Stampa. With more than 20 years in the industry, Elisabeth is currently chair of the board at Medichem, a company she transformed from being a pure API player into a vertically integrated B2B company. It's about her role at Medicines for Europe that we're going to be focused on today, where she's currently serving as vice president and is passionate about ensuring a resilient and sustainable supply chain in Europe, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Elisabeth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Luke. Happy to be here with you, sharing my thoughts about this industry.
Be great if you could introduce us to Medicines for Europe and what the association does, please.
Sure. So Medicines for Europe is an association which is over 30 years old right now. And it was created to defend the interest of the generics at that time. And then it added the biosimilar industry and also the value-added medicines to the pack. It covers over 30 independent companies, big players in the European sector, but also most of the national associations of the 27 member states in Europe.
And you recently transitioned there. You were previously president, now you're vice president currently, but you were president over a particularly turbulent time, as I suppose it always is perhaps. But as you reflect on the time that you were serving as president there, what would you say some of the big challenges were that you and the association were coming up against?
Yes, you're right. When I joined, the war between Russia and Ukraine had just started. And it took away, or it deprioritized in the European agenda the need for caring about the sustainability of the industry and making sure no shortages happened again in emergency situations like COVID-19. So that was one of the big takeaways from the COVID times, that we needed to care about which molecules we were no longer producing in Europe and our dependency from other geographies. But as the war started, that took the priority somewhere else, which was basically the war, the raising inflation, and the energy problem in Central Europe, basically.
What did that look like then in real terms? Does that just mean that it was no longer on the government's agenda and the initiatives got put on hold, or what were the implications?
I think the attack from Russia was not expected, probably at that time. It was at the beginning of the recovery it was beginning of 2022, so it was beginning of recovery of COVID with all the turmoil that had brought. And it simply was not in the agenda. So any initiatives in DG Santé, which were aimed towards focusing on shortages and how to avoid them in the future, shifted into, we have to care about the Ukrainian refugees fleeing into Austria, Poland, and how do we cope with that situation? How do we make sure they are able to continue their treatments? How they get access to medicines? How do we make sure that the energy increase does not affect the production of injectable products, for example, which is very energy intensive? So it simply shifted the priorities in a very significant way. And I would say the biggest challenge was the pharma legislation was in review, and it's still in review, but it was in the makings. I think as an industry, we are happy about the outcome. There are certain aspects which we would have liked to be more on this side of the industry, because at the end of the day, 7 out of every 10 medicines dispensed in Europe are generic products. So this is an industry we should try to protect, because lots of chronic treatments, diabetes, any cardiovascular, oncology treatments which are post-crisis, but which are for life, are basically generic. So we should try to make this industry sustainable. So the pharma legislation was on the works. We are happy about the outcome. There are still some things we're aiming to be tweaked, but all in all, it was a challenge because it was a new legislation in 20 years. However, if you think that it started in 2022 and we are in 2025 and it's not out yet, so the implementation of that legislation will probably be not effective until 2026, 27. This was a challenge on the positive side, or more positive side. The initiative on the Critical Medicines Alliance or Critical Medicines Act, which is what it should become, was a reality. It was promoted by the Belgian presidency of the European Council. And it's focused on the almost 300, 270, 300 molecules, which are in a list, which in December 23, the European Union issued the first time a critical medicines list, because up to then, each different country, individual country had its own critical medicines list, which were not always the same. So now we do have a list for all the 27 countries. And this Critical Medicines Alliance is an initiative where all the stakeholders of the industry, but industry, patient associations, hospital associations, pharmacy associations, plus the authorities and the individual member states have been gathering and meeting for over 6 months, working really hard, try to find the common grounds on how to avoid shortages in the future. Starting with this critical medicines, and out of that list, the idea is to find which are really vulnerable, in the sense of we only have one supplier, or the supply chain is very fragile, and to really identify which products we need to focus on, because it's impossible to focus on 270.
Would one of the outcomes of that be that all of those drugs, or many of those drugs, be produced in Europe? I'm assuming that many on that list currently are produced in Asia, which could leave us vulnerable to shortages. Is that one of the objectives of the alliance that became the Act?
I don't think that is the objective. The objective is to reduce the vulnerability. I think it's not realistic to think we will be able to produce everything in Europe, even if it's only, under brackets, 270 different molecules, because maybe it doesn't even make sense. But there are some products which are larger volumes, products widely consumed in Europe, ton-wise, where we have a huge dependency of the product coming from outside Europe. So I think that the common sense would say to focus on those products which are more widely consumed, probably by more patients, or a larger number of patients, rather on the few exceptions. So the idea is to establish a set of criteria to increase identify those vulnerable products, and in those which are vulnerable, really establish measures so that those products can be produced again in Europe, or produced with new processes, greener processes, or more efficient processes.
So if they can't be produced in Europe, then working with those suppliers to make sure that the supply chains are robust and resilient and sustainable.
Exactly.
Thank you. The EU faced a real shortage back in 2022 around pediatric antibiotics. And so I think you were very involved in trying to manage through that particular crisis. What happened, and what were the lessons from that?
Well, one of the things that happened is it was 2022. So for almost 2 years, we were all wearing masks. No one got a cold, basically. So very stupid, if you wish, reason no one would have thought of. That was one of the reasons. And then there were some supply chain issues that I think the lessons learned, and actually the European authorities took some measures already on the following winter, trying to coordinate the production and supply of those more vulnerable molecules. The demand is impossible to predict, because you never know if it will be a good or a bad year for flu or in those kinds of infections. It's really impossible to predict. And I give you an example: the vaccine for flu changes every year depending on the strain. So the WHO dictates which strains should be used every single year to produce a vaccine, which means that the bacteria evolve. And this happens at all extent. So the demand is difficult to predict, but also the supply could be difficult to predict, because you could have a shortage of some of the components. You could have natural disasters, and I can give you a very close example, like the flooding we had in Valencia in Spain a couple of months ago, where the not the production sites, because they were not located there, but the warehouses of some of relevant pharmaceutical companies were completely flooded. So the product had to come from Belgium or Northern Europe, somewhere else. It could not be, I mean, that product had to be thrown away. So those things have affect the demand and the supply of the product. But I think positive outcomes were there is a high awareness about potential shortages. There has been a coordination in those vulnerable molecules, and then I think the setup of the Critical Medicines Alliance is a consequence of that crisis.
You mentioned the WHO just then. What would you say the impact's likely to be of the funding crisis that the WHO's been plunged into? And in fact, if we could just talk a bit wider about that, about the impact of the new US administration on what's happening in Europe. Early days at the moment, but are there any early things that you as an organization need to respond to, or your members need to think about?
We are working on that. It's difficult to predict because it's completely uncertain, right? It's the news you can read everywhere, but if you want to go into the details, there are no details yet. Officially, there's a study on the works where an outcome should be ready by April 1st, but there's nothing there. And we really don't know, because at the end of the day, the US is very reliant on production of APIs and finished goods, pharmaceuticals produced outside the US. Mm-hmm. So I don't know to which extent the impact of the potential tariffs has been assessed and how that could impact. And it's a real fact that there are some initiatives which were already ongoing with the previous administration to reduce the price of medicines. There is a list of 15 products.
The Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a list of 15 molecules which was issued. I mean, it was issued last year for 10 molecules. Now it's 15, where really they are trying to cut the cost. They are innovative medicines, but there are these initiatives to reduce pricing. And on the other hand, if tariffs applies to import into the US of APIs or finished goods, whether generic or innovative medicines, prices are going to increase. Definitely. So it's a bit contradictory.
Yeah.
And we are aiming to work closely together with at least with our sister association in the US, the AAM, where we are on continuous contact and trying to see how this will affect, because it affects both sides of the ocean. But it's, as you are saying, everything is vague and everything is like assumptions, right? Because we don't have any certainty right now.
Is it something your members are concerned about? I mean, is it a topic of conversation for them?
It's a topic of conversation, but I would say it's not the main topic of conversation. It's a concern. I would say if you ask me, the main concern right now is the Urban Wastewater Directive, by which it has been established that the cosmetic industry and the pharmaceutical industry will have to pay for the quaternary treatment of the urban wastewaters. This is based, as it has been approved right now in Europe, is based on volumes, which means that the generic industry will have to pay a fee to cover, I mean, those to really maintain or set up those plants, and this will have a definitely impact on the cost of generic products, and it may affect the economic viability of some of the products. If you're working on very thin margins, like 10 cents, 15 cents, and you have to pay additional 5 cents to cover that, maybe the producer decides to take the product out of the market because it's no longer profitable or not making any positive margin. So that's the main concern right now.
When's that coming into force, that new directive?
2028, if I'm not wrong.
Still got some time to prepare for that, I suppose.
Yes. But it's a directive which has been approved.
Okay.
And it's a concern because if you have to, it's like if you buy a big equipment, I mean, you do the depreciation, and it's the same. I mean, the fee would be divided among the producers and depending on the volume. So it will have an impact it's an additional cost for the industry, which doesn't mean that the industry is not in favor of environmental measures, because I think the level of environmental measures in Europe is extremely high if you compare to any other continent. But this is an additional tax where it's basically only the cosmetic and the pharma industry and no other industries.
In that context, I mean, when you look at the manufacturing cost difference between Europe and Asia, how can Europe get that balance right between driving sustainability on one hand, but also remaining competitive? Because those two objectives, certainly when it comes to price, are sometimes at odds with each other.
Basically raising price, which is what no one wants to hear. But I give you an example. There's a molecule called tamoxifen, which is for the treatment or the prevention, if you wish, after breast cancer. It's taken by thousands of women in Europe. There was a large shortage in Germany, also in 2022. A pack of 100 tablets, which is over 3 months of supply. It's one tablet per day, cost €8. So each tablet costs you 8 cents. And the API supplier refused to continue supplying at such a low price to keep up that price. So when we talk about price increases, we are not talking about doubling the price. We are saying 10, 20, 15% would already cover for that additional expense. So if your mother, your sister, your wife, would have to be treated or to prevent breast cancer, how many more cents would you be ready to pay per day? More than 8. Probably you would be ready to pay 10 cents. You would say, okay, I need that because it's my life-saving treatment. So when we are talking about increasing price, we are not talking about extremely high prices or doubling prices, because if you compare price of a generic product with the innovative product, it's 25% average.
Interesting. You've talked in the past, Elisabeth, about market policies which go beyond just having a sole focus on price.
Yes.
What are the alternatives?
Well, there are different alternatives. The problem is if we only look at price, you don't take into consideration all the efforts the European companies do on sustainability on one hand. And sustainability ranges from, let's talk about ESG. So it goes from decarbonization to water waste to residues, waste emission to the air, protection of the workers, safety training. I don't know. In Europe, there are directives. Pregnant women should not be working in touching some certain chemicals. So there and you have to carry out process safety procedures. So all those regulations, which are I think logic and common sense, have a cost. If you have to have a flammable park in your manufacturing site, it has a cost because you have to keep it up and running. You have to follow the procedures. Your worker have to follow the procedures. So all this costs money. So to base the procurement policies on other factors like environmental, but also protecting your workers in an adequate manner. Having a look into the quality track record, not having had any significant withdrawal of products from the market due to quality issues. Those are interesting market policy. We are also advocating for meet criteria with most economically advantageous tenders, in the sense that you could have more than one company being awarded a tender, not just one. In many countries, the penalties if you fail to supply in a tender are so high that companies refuse to go to a tender because you have to if you win you are awarded a tender and you fail to supply, you will have to pay the difference between your generic product and the innovative product. And if the price difference is huge, and I don't know, let's say it's a 2-year tender and you are out of the market for whatever reason for 9 months, maybe though that 9 months cost you much more than the profit of the 2 full years of supply. So you simply do not go to a tender.
So what would you recommend then that those who are working in big pharma, medium-sized pharma companies, those working in procurement, sourcing activities, what advice would you give to them about how they're procuring products? You've spoken about decisive action being needed around pharmaceutical supply chain. What would that look like?
I think decisive action is not only at Brussels level or European authority level. One of the big concerns, if you wish, is that at the end of the day, it's 27 independent member states who need to implement what's set in Brussels, and pricing is a national competence. So the individual countries are dealing with their national health budgets, so they can be told whatever they want out of Brussels, but at the end of the day, they have to manage their own healthcare systems, and obviously those budgets are higher in some countries and much lower in some others. So at the end of the day, when I refer to decisive actions, is really to have a common understanding of what can be done, what needs to be done. It could be established that really this additional criteria on sustainability are included in public procurement. You could set up guidelines by which a certain percentage of the supply chain needs to be in Europe. So there are different measures you could implement.
When you joined Medicines for Europe as president 2022, it was only a couple of years after the UK unfortunately Brexited and the EMA moved across to the Netherlands. Where does the UK, from your perspective, sit within all this? I'm guessing UK is no longer part of Medicines for Europe. What has been lost as part of that? Are there still opportunities to collaborate? How do you see Europe and UK-based manufacturing collaborating?
One of the biggest issues is that the products now need to be registered and approved by MHRA in the UK. So when you could previously rely on products approved in other jurisdictions and form part of the common recognition, now you can't. So I think the burden is really on the UK patients. And I guess there are several forms of collaboration which could be established. And honestly, I'm not an expert there. So that's from my point of view, it harms more the British patients probably than the European ones.
Yeah, we hear that a lot. It's just more red tape, more bureaucracy, and just slows everything down. Slows down imports, the lot.
Yeah, if you have a single marketing authorization in Europe because you have the EMEA approving it, Britain is not included. So a parallel procedure needs to be set up in the UK. If you have a mutual recognition, which is basically used in the generic sector, whereby there is one reference country, but the others somehow adhere to that. I mean, they can have additional questions, but there is like one leading country leading all the review of the documentation. This again is not valid for the UK. So you have to rely on everyone applying for a marketing authorization in the UK, which at the end of the day is sort of duplicating a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forwards, Elisabeth, what are the key changes we should be watching for in terms of EU pharmaceutical policy? We've mentioned a couple of them already. Over the next couple of years, what would you say those sort of milestones and things to be aware of are?
One milestone is definitely the approval of the pharmaceutical legislation and the implementation in the different countries. And the second one, which we already mentioned again, is the Critical Medicines Act, because those two measures are trying to balance out the equilibrium between innovative and generic industry on one hand, but also to try to identify where we are vulnerable, where we don't have products produced in Europe, and where we need to focus on the export. It doesn't mean we definitely need to continue cooperating with other countries, because we will never be autonomous. That doesn't make any sense, possibly.
And Elisabeth, what's next for you personally?
I'm very happy to support the current president of Medicines for Europe. It has been an amazing journey. I was definitely not coming from this environment and this lobbying activity, which has been extremely interesting. And on the other hand, it has been an honor to serve this industry. I've developed all my professional career in this industry, so it's a way of giving back, because you do a lot of pro bono work for the industry. And what's for me, basically to support Stefan Eder in his presidency. The biosimilar and the generic sector has become really very relevant stakeholder in the healthcare arena in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, thanks to COVID, because then we had the realization that we really relied so much on these kind of products. But I think we need to continue trying to work out the balance here, and really make this, what is still left in Europe, to sustain it, and if possible, keep it growing.
And we look forward to you speaking at CDMO Live in May, of course, as well.
Yes, me too. Thank you.
Experience the future of contract manufacturing at CDMO Live 2025. Join us at the World Trade Centre Rotterdam on May the 7th and 8th, 2025, for an exclusive event that brings together the sharpest minds in biopharma outsourcing. For 2 days filled with market insights, best practices, and partnering. So head to cdmolive.com to download the agenda and to book your ticket.